The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. The subcontinent of India is home to a dizzying array of cultures, many of which have rich theatrical traditions that go back hundreds or even thousands of years. Today, we're going to discuss just a few of those traditions, and we're going to do something a little different from what we normally do. This is part one of a two-part conversation on the history of theater in India. Today's episode will be an overview of Sanskrit drama, in particular the performance form known as Kutiyattam. Next week, we'll look at modern Indian theater. Our guest for these two episodes is Dr. Erin Mee. She's an assistant arts professor at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and the author of Theater of Roots, Redirecting the Modern Indian Stage. She's also a stage director and the founding co-artistic director of This Is Not a Theater Company. Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Let's begin with some terminology. What do we mean when we say Sanskrit drama?
Usually we mean the major plays and playwrights. Kalidasa's Shakuntala, Shudraka's The Little Clay Cart, Vasa's Urubangam. But Sanskrit drama originated between 200 BCE and 200 CE in what we now call India, when traditions of music and dance were combined with the type of recitation used in religious rituals. So when we refer to Sanskrit drama, we refer to more than just the plays and the play texts. We refer to modes of performance. Now, we don't know everything in the same way that we don't know a lot about how Greek drama was performed. There's a lot we don't know about Sanskrit drama. There is a fantastic sort of origin story that's told in Bharata's Natya Shastra. We're not sure whether Bharata was an actual person, but the Natya Shastra, which means the science of drama, is a dramatic treatise attributed to Bharata, who may or may not be a fictional figure. But there's a story told in there about the origin of drama, that it happened at a time when people were addicted to sensual pleasures, they were greedy, they were overcome with jealousy and anger, and people went to the gods and said, what can we do with it about this? And Brahma, the creator, established a mode of diversion and instruction that would be available to everyone, which we now think of as drama. And then there was a moment where demons tried to break up a performance, and Brahma ordered a playhouse to be built to protect the performance. So what's interesting about that story is that, first of all, we think of Sanskrit drama as having been available to everyone rather than just the elites, that it is a mode of instruction, it has a moral component to it, but it's also supposed to be fun, and that the deities think it's important enough to protect it. In 1912, 13 plays by Vasa were discovered in the state of Kerala, and scholars found that these were plays that were being performed in a genre known as Kutiyattam, which is a particular way of performing Sanskrit drama in Kerala, South India. What's interesting about that is that Kutiyattam then gives us some idea of one of the ways that Sanskrit drama might have been performed. So there was a moment where scholars were saying, Kutiyattam is exactly the way Sanskrit drama was performed, and it's been handed down from generation to generation over the last 2,000 years. Now, we should take this with a grain of salt, because we obviously know that when things are handed down, changes are made. So I wouldn't agree that Kutiyattam is performed exactly the same way that it was then, but it gives us some ideas about a particular way of performing Sanskrit drama. So Kutiyattam was originally performed in temple theaters known as Kutambala, and it was performed as a visual offering to the gods. The right to perform Kutiyattam was conferred on the Chakyar caste. So there was a particular family that had both the right and the responsibility for performing Kutiyattam as a visual offering to the gods. Female members of the Chakyar family, known as Nangyars, performed the female roles and were also responsible for providing rhythmic accompaniment. So Kutiyattam, I would argue, I tend to treat it as a verb and an art form rather than a cultural artifact. I think that people tend to think of it now as a kind of UNESCO form of cultural heritage, but it's got a long, complicated history in and of itself. It, until maybe the 11th century, was very text-based and was possibly solo acting. After the 11th century, more characters were added. It was based less on the text. Plays in the Kutiyattam repertoire are based on stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and other familiar sources, epic sources. So most of the people going to see Kutiyattam already know the story going in. Kutiyattam then is not about telling the story. Performances of Kutiyattam focus on the way the performer interprets the text and embodies the narrative, not unlike jazz. You wouldn't go to hear a jazz concert to hear someone play the melody. You go to hear them riff on that melody. You go to hear them interpret that melody, right? In the same way that most of us, at least after a certain age, don't go to see Hamlet to find out what happens at the end. We go to find out what this particular director's take on Hamlet is, or this performer's take on Hamlet is, right? So a Kutiyattam performance is not the presentation of a play, but the interpretation and elaboration of the play. And it can take anywhere between 5 to 41 nights to complete. So, for example, Bhasa's play Urabangam in English translation is about 8 pages long in the edition that I have. And that would take 41 nights to complete. So each scene of the play has its own title and is meant to be performed as its own entity. And within each scene, a performer can spend up to 3 hours illuminating 3 lines of text by making political and social analogies, exploring emotional associations, and telling related or background stories. So, for example, on the first night, I might come out, and if I'm playing the lead role, and I will tell you, usually I'm improvising, we'll talk about that in a moment, we'll talk about how the elaborations happen in a moment, but I will talk about my character, the background of my character's take on the play. I might talk about important stories leading up to the moment the play begins. I might tell the story from my character's point of view. I might do all of that on the first night. I might spread that out over 5 nights. On the second night of performance, or the sixth, a second character would come out and introduce themselves to the audience. So then as the second character, I would tell the audience a little bit about myself. I would tell the story of the play from the perspective of my character. I might tell related or background stories leading up to the moment the play begins, etc., etc. And then, after a certain point, the Vidushika would come out. So the Vidushika is kind of a clown character, and his job is to translate the Sanskrit text of the play into Malayalam. So Kutiyattam is still performed in Sanskrit to this day, and Sanskrit in India is a little bit like Latin in Europe or the United States, which is to say people study it, but no one speaks it on the street, right? So the Vidushika's job is to translate the Sanskrit text of the play into Malayalam, which is the language spoken in Kerala, and to make political and social analogies between events in the play and events in the real world. So the Vidushika will improvise and make connections between something that's happening in the story and something that's happening politically or socially in the world in which the audience lives. So in this way, the story is told and retold from many points of view. The background to the story is fully explored, and the story is made relevant to the audience, and that's actually the most important aspect of a Kutiyattam performance. And this process is known as nirvahanam, which really means basically elaboration. So on the final night of Kutiyattam, the play is performed. And so what we think of when we read the play in a book is the text without elaborations. And that is, in fact, a tiny fraction of the total experience of Kutiyattam. So if we're talking about a 41-night performance, the play is performed on the final night. So the play is 1/41st of the entire experience.
Erin, I'm really curious, what is it like to be an audience member at one of these performances, given that they might go as long as 41 nights?
Well, truthfully, I think in this day and age, the only people who are at all 41 nights of a Kutiyattam performance are the PhD scholars writing their dissertations. to be completely honest. And other Kutiyattam performers who were learning and studying Kutiyattam from the masters, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really incredible. You get this incredibly detailed exegesis, if you will, on each part of the play. And Michael, I think for our podcast listeners, let me make an analogy that may or may not be useful. If you have seen the Oresteia, you know that it begins with Agamemnon, right? And in Agamemnon, there's a long kind of laundry list from the warriors returning from war, and they say, we went from here to here to here to here, to Aulis, to here, to here, to here, right? So when they say Aulis, if you know the story of Iphigenia and Aulis, or if you saw Ariane Mnouchkin's production, and by the time you see Agamemnon, you spent 3 hours the day before seeing Iphigenia and Aulis, which is the story of a father sacrificing his daughter to be able to go off to war, then that one word really punches you in the stomach. You get a real hit of emotion, right? So the experience of a spectator in Kutiyattam is not one of following a linear plot. It's not a horizontal experience across a plot line. It's a series of vertical experiences, so that you explore each aspect of the play so fully that by the time you get to the play on that 41st night, each reference carries with it a wealth of emotional experience, so that the word Aulis makes you think, oh, right, that's where the father sacrificed his daughter, killed his own daughter. So the experience then of seeing Kutiyattam on any of these first 40 nights is the experience of seeing an incredible performer delve into particular moments in an extraordinarily rich way, to bring in associations and other stories, related stories. It's a way of going so deeply into the material and resurfacing. The experience of seeing a Kutiyattam performance then is the experience of taking particular moments and taking the time to delve deeply into them and explore each moment in its richness with an entire set of associations that are political, social, emotional, and you bring that set of associations and depth to your experience of, quote unquote, the final play on the 41st night, which means that each time anything is mentioned in the final performance, you refer back to the 3 hours that you spent exploring that reference in great depth and detail. It might be like reading a paragraph with 40 footnotes. And each night is an exploration of one of those footnotes, which is in and of itself a 20-page paper. So that then on the final night of performance, if you read the paragraph, you bring to it your experience of each of those footnotes.
So for the audience, they're bringing all these different associations built up over a number of different nights of performance. But if you're a performer in Kutiyattam, how do you go from an 8-page script to this long, elaborate performance? What are you working off of?
Well, the responsibility for this thorough interpretation and elaboration is handed over to the performers, in fact. And these elaborations are physical improvisations on the text. And these are based on guidelines set out in what are called Atta Prakarams, or acting manuals. And these are passed down from teacher to student during training. And in fact, because the elaborations take precedence over the text, the acting manuals are even more important to the performers than the text of the play. So the Atta Prakaram prescribes the ways in which each actor should perform his part, and the important parts that he has to remember while performing. It details the gestures to be used. It discusses the various modes of acting, so the denotative sense of a line, the connotative sense of a line, the wordplay, etc. And remember, I'm going to talk about Kutiyattam training in a moment, but the knowledge that these performers have is given to them through training, which lasts for 7 years. And they train for about 8 hours a day, 6 days a week for 7 years. So by the time they're performing, by the time they're actually improvising, the basis for the improvisation is deeply embedded in their bodies.
It sounds like this build-up of associations leading up to the performance of the quote-unquote final play. It sounds like there's something a little bit cathartic about that, but that's not how this form of theater works. Am I correct about that?
Yes. Now, the question then is, what is the purpose of all of this elaboration, right? The goal of Sanskrit drama, the goal of Kutiyattam, is to create rasa. The Sanskrit term rasa has been translated as juice, flavor, extract, and essence. In the context of performance theory, it's defined as the aesthetic flavor or sentiment that is tasted in and through performance. The Natya Shastra notes that when food and spices are mixed together in different ways, they create different tastes. And so similarly, the mixing of different basic emotions arising from different situations, when expressed through the performer, gives rise to or brings out an emotional experience in the spectator, which is rasa. And there's a later 10th century aesthetic theorist, Abhinavagupta, who describes rasa as an act of relishing. So rasa is active, sensorial, experiential, it's in the body. It exists actually neither in the performer nor in the partaker, but in their interaction. So it exists so rasa positions the audience member as an active participant and partaker and co-creator of the event, in fact. So rasa is really an act of relishing. So the emotion that is embedded in the text or the situation is extracted by the actor, converted using the actor's imagination into a sort of emotional essence, which is then made enjoyable and shared with the audience member, spectator, partaker, I would say, who experiences the essence in this new way.
Now, what about the performers themselves? I mean, how do you create this sense of sort of working together with the audience to create this feeling? What is required in terms of training, in terms of performance?
Well, let me talk about Kutiyattam training for a moment. Kutiyattam performers train for about 7 years. Kutiyattam training has gone through and continues to go through a number of changes. Back in the day, Kutiyattam performers would be trained by a father, an uncle, a family member, and training would begin when they were very, very young. And, of course, if you're trained by your father, then you're living with your father, you're going to see performances, etc., and then you also gain some formal training as you go, and then as you get older, the training becomes more and more formal. Training of Kutiyattam performers has become institutionalized at places like Mardi, the Kerala Kalamandalam, and Iranyalakuda. And at the Kalamandalam, performers train for about 7 years, 6 days a week. They get up very early in the morning, and they will do eye exercises from about 4 to 6 in the morning, then have breakfast, then do facial exercises, gesture exercises, leg exercises, etc., and study the plays. So this training goes on with various, breaks for meals and etc. throughout the entire day, and that's 6 days a week. By the time they have graduated, they have learned to really embody the text, the stories, the narratives, the modes of elaboration, so that in performance, They're improvising. They begin by studying each aspect of performance separately, which is to say they study just the eye exercises, and then they do just the facial exercises. They do the hand gestures. They learn the shlokas and they learn to speak. And then they learn to put them together. And the reason for that is that there's a phrase that's used for Kutiyattam and Kathakali training, which is where the hand, there the eye. Where the eye, there the mind. Where the mind, there the heart. Where the heart, there the rasa, the emotional essence. And what this phrase embodies is a notion that if you do the gesture correctly and you are observing yourself as you are doing it, the emotion will follow. And from the attention and the emotion within yourself, the rasa will follow, which is to say then you will be communicating and exchanging the emotional essence with the audience. And I like to refer to the audience as partaker, because if we're talking about rasa, we're talking about ingesting an emotional essence. So metaphorically then it's a tasting of emotion, which means that the audience is partaking, internalizing, right, digesting what's happening on stage. And so the performer then is their own first audience member. And we know this from neuroscience now. There's a feedback loop between feeling and doing, which is to say that if you smile, you can make yourself feel happier. At the same time, if you are happy, you are more likely to smile, right? But there's a feedback loop between the facial expression of joy, happiness, and the emotion and feeling of that, of happiness, yeah? So Kutiyattam performers are trained to generate the emotion through the embodied doing of the expression of that emotion. And the term for acting, actually, in Sanskrit drama is abhinaya, which means to carry forward. And so the job then of the performer is to carry that emotion forward and share it with the partaker. So the idea then is that you directly acknowledge, there is no fourth wall in Kutiyattam, you directly acknowledge and communicate with the partaker. And in fact invite them to co-create with you. So let's say that I am a Kutiyattam performer and I am pouring water from a jug into a basin. Not a fascinating example, but one that will prove my point. So what I do as the performer is I make the motion of pouring the water, and I mime holding the jug, yeah? The musicians provide the sound of the water, and the partaker has to provide in their mind's eye the jug itself. So the three of us, the performer, the musician, and the partaker, co-create this moment. And I'm using the most simple sort of example of that, but I would say that the performer, the musician, and the partaker are always co-creating Kutiyattam, so that the partaker then also has to lean into the performance and use their own imagination and help to co-create. You don't get to sort of lean back and say, hey, do your thing. You have to really lean into the performance and help. You have to participate. And this is also then why the job of the performer is not to present something to the audience, but to carry forward. And so the role, the performer in Kutiyattam and other genres of classical performance, the actor is often referred to as a katapatram. Kata means story, patram means pot or vessel. So the performer is a vessel for carrying the story, the emotion, etc. forward and giving it to the partaker. And so in the same way that in order to give you a glass of wine, the glass doesn't have to become the wine for you to taste the wine. The glass has to carry the wine to your lips. So the performer then is like the wine glass for the aesthetic experience. I carry it forward and give it to the partaker, who then ingests it.
Now, Erin, what is a Kutiyattam performer wearing during one of these performances?
Sanskrit drama doesn't hold up a mirror to life. Most of the characters are gods, heroes, or demons. And so the costuming in Kutiyattam is designed to look otherworldly. The costumes show character type rather than individual characteristics. Individuality is in the acting and not in the costuming. And the makeup reflects the moral characteristics of the character. So the more distorted the makeup of the character, the more distorted the moral characteristics are of the character. So if you look at the video clips that will be posted, that Michael will post to the, end of the podcast, you will see there things that look like little ping pong balls on the face of some of the characters. And if you look at the profile then, those white blobs distort the profile of the character. And so in the same way that the character is physically distorted on the outside, that's an outward manifestation of the moral distortion of the character on the inside. So the costumes really are meant to tell you about the moral characteristics of the character rather than the psychological motivations of characteristics.
So, Erin, I have to make a confession here. As someone who's taught my fair share of theater survey and theater introduction courses, I'm always a little bit at a loss as to how to frame and teach a play like Kalidasa's Shakuntala. Can you tell us a little bit about how these ancient Sanskrit plays are different from what we might expect from an ancient Greek drama or from a modern Western drama?
Shakuntala is a beautiful play. To be honest, Michael, I always assign the plays of Bhasa to my students because I can then connect Bhasa quite directly to Kutiyattam so that they then have some idea of how Bhasa's plays might have been performed. My students always have their minds blown when I tell them that this 8-page play that they read would take 41 nights to perform. And I think that's one of the biggest differences, is that Sanskrit drama, from what we know, would not have been playwright-initiated, text-based, plot-driven. So the elaborations would really, the nirvahanam is what would be the focus of performance. And I think it's difficult to read Shakuntala and imagine how that might be performed over 41 nights. I think one thing or more, given the fact that it's a longer play, the thing to remember about Shakuntala, about all of these Sanskrit dramas, is that the goal is not to create a cathartic experience, but a rasic experience. So if catharsis is about the purging of excess emotion, right? A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, leads to E, leads to a cathartic moment and a denouement, right? Because the ancient Greeks believed that moderation was the goal, that too much emotion was not healthy. And so catharsis was designed to purge excess emotion. In order to reach that climactic moment, you need a linear structure that builds, right? Where the tension builds and the tension builds and the tension builds. So you need to go from A to B to C to D to E. And in moving from A to E, tension has to continue to build until finally you reach a climactic moment and there is a release of excess emotion. And then you wrap everything up and then people go home. Rasa is about savoring emotion. It's about relishing emotion. So it's fundamentally a different approach to an idea about emotion, which is that emotion is not something that needs purging. It's something that needs to be relished. And so these Sanskrit dramas are about generating, wallowing in, relishing, experiencing emotion. And to do that, you need a dramaturgical structure that allows you to go deep into particular moments and to relish them. And then you move along and then you go deeply into another moment. And you relish that and you roll it around on your tongue, metaphorically. And then you move on to something else. So I think students reading Shakuntala should know that they should stop and relish each moment for what it is and think about the ramifications. In other words, I always think if you start creating associations as you read Shakuntala. That's what a performance of Sanskrit drama would be designed to do as well. So that rather than sort of reading across the text, you want to get to a particular moment and then start daydreaming, having all of your emotional and political and social associations with that moment.
Kutiyattam sounds like a fascinating and complicated performance tradition. I'm curious, how is it performed today, and does the way that it's performed today reflect any changes in modern India?
Well, it's performed in a number of different ways. So there are still performances that last 41 nights. They happen in temples, etc. There are performances on proscenium stages. There are performances that last for 5 days in temples. There are what I call tourist performances, some of which are about an hour long. There are performances that are of sort of what I would call excerpts of Kutiyattam, of particular scenes or moments that might last 3 hours. So you can still see an evening of Kutiyattam where the performers are elaborating on 3 lines of text. So you're not then seeing, quote unquote, the whole play, but you're seeing a traditional mode of elaboration on 3 or 4 lines of text. Kutiyattam is then performed in what I would call secular situations, on proscenium stages, as part of festivals, etc. There are adaptations of Kutiyattam that have been performed, and G. Venu has a 2-hour version of the play Shakuntala. Now, if you're used to a 41-night version of Kutiyattam, you can imagine that the 2-hour version might feel incredibly different. And so purists in Kerala will say that this is really no longer Kutiyattam, that it might be performed by a Kutiyattam, someone who's trained in Kutiyattam, someone who identifies as a Kutiyattam performer, but that if you don't have the elaboration, you're not really doing Kutiyattam. Others might say that if you're not performing it in a temple or as an offering to the deities, you're not really performing Kutiyattam. Others might argue that if you have eliminated the Vidushika, the clown character, and if the play is not being translated both literally and metaphorically, and the connections are not being made to the audience, then it's not Kutiyattam. But I think that Kutiyattam as a genre can expand to include the large number of manifestations of it that exist.
We'll post images and video of Kutiyattam performances in our show notes. Join me and Erin next week when we'll discuss how theater has changed in modern India. Erin, thank you so much.
Michael, thank you so much.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter and Facebook. You can also visit our website at theaterhistorypodcast.net. Big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our music this week comes from the Center for Excellence in Kutiyattam. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.